Welcome to the webinar for using Biblingo in the 2024-2025 school year. We did this several years ago, and I thought it would be helpful to do it again because Biblingo is very different than what it was several years ago. So we will probably end up doing this yearly. I want to introduce you in this webinar to what it looks like to use Biblingo in the classroom. So that's what we're going to talk about. More specifically, we will go through what is the goal of a language course in general. And we're going to compare what we see in the second language acquisition literature to what we see in typical textbooks to what we have in Biblingo. Next, we're going to look at Biblingo's grammatical progression, again, comparing what we would see in the second language acquisition literature. I'll just shorten that to SLA, and then compare that to what we see in a typical textbook. I'll be using Rob Plummer's beginning with New Testament Greek, Rob Plummer and Benjamin Merkel right here as a sort of comparison. And then we will be talking about Biblingo's grammatical progression. We will go through the app and show you what it looks like to use Biblingo if you haven't seen it before. And then we'll also look at in-class materials. Some of this is new, some of this is old, but we are trying to make it as easy as possible for you to use and adopt Biblingo in the classroom. And so that's what this webinar is all about. So to begin with, what is the goal of a language course? And I want to start here because in Biblingo, we have rethought what it means to learn Hebrew and Greek. We've said, okay, how do we approach learning Hebrew and Greek, these languages, without necessarily thinking about how it's been done in the classroom setting before? So that's what we wanted to do. And we wanted to really make the goal learning the language as efficiently and effectively as possible. So I want to start here because many of you who are teaching Hebrew and Greek in a university setting, the goal is just assumed because you've been in the university for a long time and the ways Greek and Hebrew have been taught is very much the same as, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so I want to go back to the goal. What are we trying to accomplish? And then we're going to tie that into the method, the ways in which we go about learning these languages. So throughout, I'll be talking about Greek and Hebrew. This applies across the board to both languages. I'll be showing you some resources from Greek, some resources from Hebrew. If you only do Greek or only do Hebrew, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. You can just see what it would be like in Hebrew or Greek as well. Okay, so in the SLA research, what is the goal of a language course? So let's start out with Stephen Krashen. He is dated at this point, to be fair, for sure. And the SLA literature has moved on to bigger and better questions than some of Krashen's earliest theories, but it's still foundational. Some of the things he says, and one of the things he does is he makes a distinction between a language acquisition and language learning. Again, the terms don't really matter here, but here's how he describes language acquisition. He says, it is a subconscious process, and language acquirers are only aware of the fact that they are using the language for communication. So what does it mean to acquire a language? It means that you are able to use the language for communication. So communication could involve reading, writing, speaking, or listening. So reading falls under communication. And this is an important point here because many people who advocate for a communicative methodology really are advocating for speaking. And that can be helpful, but reading is just as much communication as speaking. It's just a different kind of communication. So we'll come back to this. But the point here is that we are trying to acquire the language to be used in communication. That's foundational. Secondly, Paul Nation talks about fluency. Fluency relates to being able to receive and produce language at a reasonable rate. So this is very important for a number of things. The reason why it would be a goal here to become fluent in the biblical languages is because there is a correlation between, for us, let's say we're talking about reading, there's a correlation between reading fluency and reading comprehension. The idea is that you actually cannot understand what you read if you can't read fast enough, because you can't hold the whole picture of the discourse together in your mind if you're reading too slow. Right? We only have so much brain capacity, and that will reach its limit very quickly if we are struggling over every other letter, trying to figure out what sound that letter makes. Okay, so this is really important. Fluency is the ability to receive and produce language at a reasonable rate. And that is part of the goal, should be part of the goal of a second language class. So in a typical seminary or university setting, the goals might look something like this. The first 2 semesters, you learn the most frequent vocabulary and learn to parse or recognize the morphology. You want to be able to look at a text, parse it, and gloss the words. Okay, and most of the exercises are built around that kind of thing. The next 2 semesters are often then focusing on exegesis or determining and describing the meaning of the forms that we just learned in the first 2 semesters. That's typically how universities will structure their language program, and both on a macro level and on a micro level. First 2 semesters, Greek 1 and 2, Hebrew 1 and 2, learn frequent vocabulary, learn to parse and recognize the forms, and then in the next 2 semesters really dig into the meaning. Biblingo's goals are different, right? And really it's regardless of the time allocated. And this is an important distinction between Biblingo. We don't have this sort of bifurcated morphology first and then exegesis after approach. It's definitely a both and throughout. So we want students to acquire the language through meaningful use and develop fluency in part of the language, whatever part they learn. And so we will come back to this, but the idea in brief is that whatever I learn, I can become fluent in whatever part of the language. So fluency in the SLA literature is very different than what we might think of as fluency in normal everyday use, right? If I say I'm fluent in Hebrew, I would usually mean that I can carry on a conversation with someone without too much difficulty, something like that. But this is a different definition. I can be fluent in a very, very small part of any language. And so it's the ability to use that quickly and effortlessly. So second, students can talk about the language precisely. So we want students to be able to talk about the language precisely. And this is different than a lot of goals in the SLA literature. And this is much more similar to the second year classes in seminary or university setting where we focus on exegesis. The Bible is unique in that Greek and Hebrew are languages that people want to talk about precisely. These aren't languages that people want to just learn so that they can read. These are languages that people want to learn so that they can read and study and make claims about the grammar, right? That's very different than if I'm just learning French to read French. I actually don't care about making claims about, a particular French construction. That's not my goal. My goal is to be able to just read a text and understand it or talk to someone or whatever. But we recognize that this is a part of learning these particular languages. And so we have plenty of material to teach people how to talk about the language precisely or how to do exegesis. And third, we want students to develop a passion to become lifelong learners of Greek and Hebrew. And this is not a peripheral goal for us. This is a central goal. We really believe that a language course really has to be captivating. It has to be motivating and fun so that people continue. No matter what your method is, you're going to need more than 2 semesters or 1 year or 2 years or 3 years to learn to master these languages, right? You actually can get quite far in a few years, but you should always be learning. And in order to have students develop a passion for these languages, it can't be boring, right? We have to get people through the stages that are not as fun. And we have to do so by presenting the material in an engaging way. So that's what we are trying to do as well. So that brings us to Biblingo's grammatical progression and schedule. And we're going to compare this to a typical textbook, like I said. And we're also going to look at the SLA literature on this to inform us on what we should be thinking about when we think through what an optimal grammatical schedule or progression should be. So going back to some of this literature, remember the acquisition of a language is the ability to use the language. And specifically here, we're talking more about reading, right? Because the texts that we want to read are all that we have in terms of the native speaker content of the language we are trying to learn. They are dead languages in that sense. We still have native speaker content. It's just encoded in text. So we are trying to get people to have the ability to use these languages. So first, Krashen has a principle called I+1. This is comprehensible input. The idea is that the material for you to learn or acquire a language should be at I+1. I meaning the knowledge that the student is currently at, plus one, meaning one new element. We'll give a concrete example of this in a second in Greek, but in English, if I have a sentence like the cat is in the room, if I know all of those words except for the and cat, it is very hard for me to understand what that sentence means because there are two unknown elements in the sentence, and it's hard for me to parse what exactly is being intended, especially if I don't have any sort of visual or description of what's going on. How do I know what the word cat refers to if I don't know the and I don't know cat? So the idea is that if you have your input, your comprehensible input at an I+1 level, it gives you the ability to deduce what the one is, right? And that's exactly what you want. You want to gradually gain more and more knowledge of the language by using the language you already know and encountering sentences that teaches you something new. Not multiple things new, but one thing that is new. And that allows you to learn that new one thing. And then you add that to I and you learn the next thing. Okay, so this is really foundational. And honestly, part of the problem for many communicative approaches is that this principle isn't held to, is that the people are so concerned about staying in the language, staying in Greek and Hebrew or immersion or that kind of thing. That's great. Immersion is great only, though, insofar as the input is comprehensible, right? Immersion is great because you get a lot of input. But if someone starts talking to me in Cantonese and I don't know any Cantonese, I will not learn Cantonese, right? If someone says, though, holds up a book, right? And I should have looked up the word for book in Cantonese before I said this. But if they then say book in Cantonese, I can learn that one word, right? Because my eye is nothing. And all you're doing is giving me one thing to learn. Okay. So this is exactly the same principle, but on a bigger scale. So once I learn the word book in Cantonese, then I can learn the book, right? One book, two books, right? I can then take my knowledge and I can build on it. That's the idea. Next is nation's fluency principle. So again, we want to be getting fluent at the things that we learn. So fluency is not just about learning new things. It's about getting faster and better at old things. So this will shape both of these things. Krashen's I+1 principle and nation's fluency principle should shape the grammatical progression in our language classrooms, as well as the amount of time we allocate towards review and those kinds of things. Next, there's a principle on meaningful input. Again, this is really important for us who are trying to teach students how to read. You should know 95% at minimum words in a text in order for that text to be meaningful to you. So if you know anything under that, it's basically too difficult of a text for you to interact with the text itself meaningfully. At that point, you have too many new vocabulary words to learn. You have too many new grammatical constructions to learn to understand the text as itself. Okay, so that is also important. It should shape our grammatical progression. Finally, the frequency principle, and this is just drawing from a lot of literature that talks about learning the most frequent vocabulary words first. And the reason why you would do that is because it opens up the door for you to read and understand more text more quickly. And this is what you want, right? You want to get to the point as quickly as possible to where you can start to consume more and more text. If you don't get there, what ends up happening is you are stuck with nothing to read and nothing to practice with, right? And this is the problem with acquiring, especially a dead language. The Old Testament and the New Testament are not written to seminary students or university students learning Greek and Hebrew, right? So the language that they are required to know in order to just enter into the text is very high. So you want to get them as quickly as possible to be able to read those texts. And then once they start to read those texts, they start to learn new words. And then it starts to compound and they can start to read more and more texts and get better and better. Okay, so these are some of the principles that we want to be thinking through when we're thinking through what is the optimal grammatical progression. So a typical grammatical progression. So again, I'm going to use beginning with New Testament Greek here. Merkel and Plummer's book, this is not at all a knock on them. Okay. We really like Rob Plummer. He's been very supportive of us. And, just truthfully, in terms of textbooks like this one is great, right? But it is different, right? It is different than what we are doing. And so I want to just show you some of the differences so that you can see for yourself, what does it look like to adopt this in the classroom? And what does it look like to adopt Biblingo in the classroom? So first of all, typical textbooks, the chapters normally present an entire paradigm. Again, this is from Merkel and Plummer's book. All the first declension forms are presented in chapter 2. So chapter 1 is the alphabet. Chapter 2 is all of the first declension forms. So if you actually look at the number of forms presented, it's 16 forms. You have singular and plural, all 4 cases, for 2 separate, the alpha and eta patterns, first declension nouns. Okay, so that's 16 forms that the student has to learn. And that's very typical. Multiple grammatical concepts are taught at once. So again, in this second chapter, and again, to be fair to them, the beginning is always the hardest because you're trying to not present too much information to the student at once. But the problem is they don't know anything. So you have to talk about all kinds of things because they know nothing. But because entire paradigms are presented, because they've presented all of first declension with nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, right? They have to talk about a lot of different grammatical concepts. And so I just listed some of them here. A noun, right? Some people do not know what a noun is. Even that is actually very tricky in linguistics. What is a noun? But even assuming that they know that, case, many people will not know what case is. Number, again, not as simple as it may seem, but singular versus plural. Gender, many people will not know what grammatical gender is. A morpheme, inflection, the article, conjunctions, parsing. So these are all terms that the language student needs to learn alongside of the forms that they need to learn and the vocabulary that they're learning. Okay. And then finally, the meaningful exercises are almost exclusively through English. So it's taking a little phrase, translate this into English, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a couple of implications of these kinds of textbooks. Again, just to reiterate once more, we think that we are on the same team as these other textbooks that are doing things differently. We all want to learn God's word better. So don't hear me say this disparagingly, because I'm not saying it disparagingly. This is how it's been done. And we think that there is a better way forward. But at the same time, we respect and love the people that have done it differently. So some implications. You can't use all of the forms that are learned meaningfully. There are 16 forms learned, right? So even just reducing it to 8, the 4 cases, singular and plural, 8 forms. You can't use all of those forms meaningfully. First of all, because you don't know a verb. But secondly, because it would be impossible to learn those morphemes, case and number endings, well enough to be able to use those forms meaningfully. You certainly can learn the endings well enough to reproduce the chart. Okay. But at that point, you don't know how to use it. You don't know how to use the accusative case. You might be able to say phone in a sentence, right? And phonane, but you don't know the meaningful distinction between those two. And you can't use that because it's too many, right? It's not I plus 1. This is our next point, right? We have way too many forms to learn each one of them well. And we're not put into a meaningful environment where we can acquire those forms subconsciously. And that's really the goal. We actually don't, when we're reading through a text, we don't want to be parsing. We want to be reading. We want to be getting meaning out of the text. We don't want to be parsing. The parsing has to be implicit. Okay. And so we can't develop that at this point. And again, this is the second chapter, right? First chapter is alphabet. So you might be able to get to this later on, but certainly you're not doing this here. It's also not possible to develop fluency with this. Again, there's too many forms. There's not enough practice with things that you know. And again, this is the second chapter. So we can understand that there's no fluency drills here, but you actually should be doing drills to become fluent in the alphabet. And this is a really important point, that the alphabet is often not learned well enough to read a text fluently. People do not get good enough at the grapheme to sound correspondence to read fluently. And that's a huge problem. So there's no attention to fluency of mastering, of getting very fast at what you already know. Greek is also always read through English. And this is something that I think is really important for the field in general. And again, goes for Hebrew as well. We don't want to be reading our Greek or Hebrew as if they are English glosses, right? We want to be reading them on their own. But the problem is, if all of our exercises have us going from Greek to English, then it's hard for us to think about Greek on its own and not as a set of English glosses. Okay, so we'll get back to this when we talk about Biblingo, but this is an important point because the entire point of reading Greek is to understand the text as it is not in English, not in our translations, right? We want to get to the original understanding, and then we want to ask a different question of how then might we translate this in the best way to English. And the frequency principle is partially held to. In general, Greek and Hebrew textbooks do a good job of this. They usually have the more frequent words up front. And this is something that, again, it's hard to do perfectly, but they generally do good with this. Okay, so it's partially held to. Biblingo's grammatical progression. Lessons present one new grammar point to be used. Anthropos krasde is our example. This is our first sentence. So we're basically going to present you only the grammar that you need in order to understand that sentence. And really, you don't even need any grammar to understand it. What you need is, you need a picture of an anthropos first. You need a picture or a video of someone doing whatever krasde refers to, and then you need to put them together in a sentence, and the person will understand it. And I've done this with my kids, and they understand it, right? My kids know what this sentence means because they have connected the forms or the sounds with the meaning. And at the end of the day, that's what you need to do to acquire the language. And so we would present one new grammar point in each lesson, and that is going to be used in that lesson, used meaningfully in sentences. So whenever you are learning a new grammar point, you are learning to use that grammar point. So this is the I+1 principle, and this is really what Biblingo's whole grammatical progression is built on, is this I+1. We will teach you one new grammar point at a time. We will force you to use that grammar point, whatever it is that we're teaching you, meaningfully in sentences so that you understand how it's used. And then we'll teach you another one, right? So we're trying to make that +1 part of I, and then we give you another +1, okay? The next point here is that the grammar given is only what's necessary for language use. So again, the idea is that they don't need to know what accusative case is if their sentence is anthropos krasde. They don't need to know what the article is. They don't need to know a lot of things, right? We can tell them what nominative case is and what the present tense is, because those are the forms used. And that's what we do. So we do tell them, this is part of Biblingo, we do tell you what is nominative case. You should be aware that this is how people talk about Greek or Hebrew. And so we do have explicit grammar instruction. That's very different than some other communicative approaches that do not give you explicit grammar instruction. So we give you that, and we give it to you full bore linguistics terminology. And so we will try to teach you that, but we'll try to teach you step by step. Okay. And so, and the meaningful exercises are taught through the world and in Greek. And we try not to use English as much as we can. And so this is, again, something that you'll see in the app. But we have videos and images paired with each of these sentences. So the idea is that what we want is for students to be able to be thinking in Greek, right, about the biblical world when they're reading the text. Again, same applies to Hebrew. So we don't want them to be thinking, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. We don't want them to be thinking like Bereshit. That is in the beginning, right? We don't want them to be thinking that, because in the beginning is just their English translation, right? That's not at all what we want them to be thinking. We want them to be thinking, what does be in Reshit mean in Hebrew, right? Bereshit bara. And sure, in the beginning is a decent approximation of that. But ultimately, we want them to be reading Hebrew for Hebrew and not for the English glosses, because we want them to be understanding it as the original authors understood it. So Greek and Hebrew are read and practiced through the world of the Bible and not through a second language. So all of this affects the grammatical progression. So our grammatical progression is built on these principles that we find in the SLA literature. We're going to give you short stories that are on your level. And that means that you will know at least 95% of the words known. Then we're going to build in fluency practice. We want you to get fast at what you know so that when you're reading the text, you're not parsing, at least not explicitly. You are implicitly recognizing forms and connecting them in milliseconds with their meaning so that ultimately you can read fast enough to get the whole picture of the meaning of the discourse, right? And that's what we're after. So Biblingo's schedule, what do you actually do? This is what you actually do. So this is from my textbook that I'm writing, which I will show as well in a minute. But this is a sample of what you would do in a 15-week schedule. So the idea is that you would do one lesson per week. This is just what we recommend. And you would spend 2 weeks on the alphabet. Again, it is very important that the alphabet is learned very well. What I tell people is you should be able to be thinking about what you ate for breakfast this morning as you read a text in Hebrew or Greek. And the reason why I want you to be able to be thinking about that, again, we can do this kind of thing in English, right? We can just be, what did I just read? Right? I'm reading and I just am daydreaming about something else. The reason why we can do that is because we are so automatic at the graphing to sound correspondence. We're pronouncing the words in our head and we're just thinking about something else. And so we want that same level of familiarity with the Greek and Hebrew alphabet because we actually want you to be able to be thinking about something else as you're reading the text. We want you to be thinking about how this text interacts with the meaning elsewhere, right? We want you to be thinking about how this sentence interacts with what you read 3 chapters ago, right? So those are the kinds of connections you can make if you are a fast enough reader and if you're fluent in the alphabet and in the morphology and in the vocabulary. So we have this schedule of 1 lesson per week and a review every 4 to 5 lessons. Okay. So this review is meant to further develop fluency. A whole week on review seems like a lot, but if the goal is to acquire the language and to develop fluency, we believe that this is a very important part of that. And so you would just march through the lessons, again, 1 per week, with this 4th week, every 4 lessons in review, and you would just keep going for however long you have, however many semesters. Okay, so what does this mean? And let me just back up here really quick. I'm going to talk about week 14, 15, this morph week is what I call it. I'll talk about what that is in a second when we get to what this looks like in the classrooms or in the full semester. So how far do you get in Biblingo? In 1 semester, you learn about 300 vocabulary words. So in 1 semester, this is a lot compared to a lot of other books. So 600 in a whole year. You have productive knowledge of all or most strong verb forms in 2 semesters, all strong noun and adjective forms. So that means that you can actually use them in a sentence. If someone asked you, like, how do you say this in Greek? If you know those words and those forms, you should be able to tell them how you say that in Greek. And so that is productive knowledge. If you have productive knowledge, then you can also fill out a paradigm chart, right? And you can also parse very easily because the form is inside of you. You can just produce it. And this provides an easy gateway into the rest of the paradigms. So I know many people have a certain amount of paradigms or forms that they have to get through. And the textbooks will get you through all of those forms in a certain amount of time. So that's fine. Again, what we've seen is, what I suggested is that you can't really get fluent with those forms in the way that they're taught. So, but to be fair, that's not really the goal, right? And that's okay. The goal is to recognize the forms, be able to parse the forms so that you can connect the forms with meaning in exegesis in the next 2 semesters. That's fine. Because we're doing things differently, you're not getting through all the forms. Now, the forms that you're getting through, you are learning to produce. And so you know the forms much better and you can read those forms at much, much faster speeds. But there are some paradigms that you need to cover. And so that's why we have this 2-week block at the end called a morph week. Basically, taking the morphology that you haven't learned yet and connecting that to the morphology you have learned to learn how to parse those forms. So if you know all of the forms really, really well, all of the strong forms, it's not hard to learn some of the irregular forms by looking at the charts, right? It is a matter of learning principles on how to build words in Greek or Hebrew. So we basically have these 2 weeks at the end to allow teachers to go over some of the forms if they need to give students the ability to parse things that they would not otherwise have. You will have read dozens of stories fluently, and we'll talk about how we do that with 8+ of them being simplified biblical stories in the second semester. And you'll have hundreds of opportunities to think in Greek or Hebrew. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sentences, or really over 1,000, that they will cover in 2 semesters. And so every time you have a sentence, you have the opportunity to think in Greek and Hebrew. You see the world, and you have to put that content, whatever's reflected in the world, into Greek and Hebrew. So now I'm going to shift gears here. I'm going to open up the app, and we're going to demo, or I'm going to demo the app as well as its resources. So I'm going to come here, go back here. We're going to start with the app demo, this is the overview, and then the in-class materials demo. So we're going to talk about in-class slides, quizzes, and the textbook that I'm working on. So we're going to resume learning here, and we'll just enter into the first lesson. So this is the app, what you will see in Biblingo. We're changing some of this interface, but this is the basic structure. First, you have this introductory video. They're usually 5 minutes long or so. The first one is a little bit longer because, I'm welcoming you to the program, yada, yada, telling you about these videos. But I'm going over different grammatical points. So again, accents. You don't need to know all the accents right away, but you need to know acute and you need to know grave because those are in the sentences. So these are the kinds of things that we discuss. Again, whatever grammar that you need in the sentences and words, okay, that are practiced in this lesson. We also have these lesson guides. These are being replaced now with the textbook, which again, I will show you. And then we go through the lesson, which is vocabulary, grammar, and a final grammar question, along with stories and a fluency drill, which I will show you in a second. These first few lessons don't have stories. That's why it's not here. But the idea is that you go through each word, and this in particular is the association stage. You're associating the Greek word with the sound. So for Greek, we have 4 different pronunciations, basically any that you could possibly think of or want. And in Hebrew, we have 2 different pronunciations, and you can pick your pronunciation, whatever you want to use in the classroom, and you can listen to the audio. You have lexical info here, human being, semantic domain, noun category. This stuff, again, is not super important for us at this stage. What's important here is we're associating the Greek letters and sounds with a meaning. And so that's what we're doing for each of these images. We're associating the Greek with the biblical world specifically. And so all of these images and videos were shot in Israel, and we're trying to represent the biblical world as much as possible. So here, this is the passive stage, association passive. Here we have, you're needing to recognize the words now, right? You have the picture here, and you choose the correct answer. And then we have the active stage. And this is where you really start to learn, you're forced to learn the words. We always suggest typing, especially in a university setting. It does take some time to learn the keyboard. We have tutorials for this and the help guides, that kind of thing. So you would type the words. You can also use a word bank. Again, we don't recommend this, but here's a word bank if you need it or if you want to use it that way. And then also speaking. You can just speak it, and then here you're recording back, hear the answer, then you mark yourself. Okay, so this is the active stage. So you go through all the words in vocabulary for written association, passive, and active stages, and then you come to the grammar. So again, the grammar topics are very small, right? In this particular lesson, all we're learning is nominative singular, masculine, feminine, neuter. So anthropos krasde, teknon krasde, adelphe krasde. So you need a verb to learn nominative case, because nominative normally says that you are the subject of a verb, or obviously the predicate in a copula clause. So in some sense, you are learning grammatical points here, but because krasde is the only form that you know at this point, you don't even know, you don't know anything about the rest of the paradigm, right? And we taught you the word as krasde. nariskrasdo. So you don't need to change the form at all. You should be able to understand this sentence, right? Because you've learned adelphe, you've learned krasde. Oh, this is an adelphe krasde, right? So you go through this association stage as well for these sentences. And then you go to the passive stage. Here, same thing. I have the picture or video. I choose the correct one. And then you go to the active stage. Again, I have the picture or video, and I have to type, use the word bank, or speak it. Okay. And then here we have a new sentence. And this is usually one that you haven't seen before. In the first lesson, it is one that you have seen before because you only know 6 words at this point. But this would normally be a sentence that you haven't seen before, and you have to produce it without seeing it in the association and passive stages first. So that's a basic lesson. In most of the lessons, I'll show you here, you have these little ribbons. And then in some lessons, you have the stars. So the little ribbons represent reading comprehension stories. So I'll pull up the first one here. So this is a story that the students should know 100% of the words of. They have been taught all these words, and we know they've been taught them because we taught them to them. So by the time you get to lesson 2.3, you should be able to recognize all these words, read this story, and answer questions in Greek. So this is fill in blank. This is what you should be able to do. So these stories are made up, at least until you get further along. And the reason why we do that, and we try to stick to, obviously, we try to replicate or stick to constructions from Koine, from the Bible. And we do that because if you need to know 95% of the words, right, for you to focus on the meaning, you inevitably have to come up with stories on your level. So again, if you're teaching English, it's easy to do this, right? Because we have those stories, the Bob books, right? Whatever stories you want with a very limited vocabulary, you can read. So we've come up with these stories to give people reading material on their level. And so at this point, lesson 2.3, there's 6 words per sublesson. So you know 42 words at this point. Even though you know 42 words, you can read this and understand it. Okay, and that's the idea. You're getting better at reading as you are interacting with this text. And then we have fluency drills. Fluency drills are taking a paradigm and trying to master that paradigm. So basically what we're doing is we're isolating a particular grammatical form or paradigm, and we are drilling it so that you can internalize it. So here we have blank peep day. So you can do the word bank or typing or speaking occasionally. And so you basically have to look at the lexical item, write out whatever that form is. Sorry, wrong accent. It's gene, etc., etc. So you go through. This is a picture of a doulos, holuknos tu, dulu pipte. So the idea is that you're getting practice with this paradigm over and over and over again, and you're isolating that paradigm with that vocabulary word. So you are mastering that paradigm. So in a lesson, that's the basic overview. You go through the main core of the lesson plus any fluency drills or reading comprehension that are associated with that lesson, and you keep going. We do have alphabet lessons before this. This is actually much better in the app, the mobile app. You can check it out there, but we do have alphabet lessons. And again, we think those are very important. We have a lot of drills to practice the alphabet. At the end of each day, the words that you have practiced are put into this spaced repetition algorithm loop. And so here's the words that need practice deck that is automatically generated for you. So on Thursday, May 23rd, 2024, I need to practice these words. So this is also a really important part of learning vocabulary well, is doing these words that need practice every single day and learning the vocabulary words. So that's the basic progression through Biblingo's lessons. We are changing some of this interface. We're matching it with mobile. What you will see will be gone by the fall, but the same basic functionality will be there. Just to point out one thing about terminology, 1.1 to 1.4 is counted as a full lesson. Again, we might change that terminology as well to something like level and make, this thing a lesson, this thing a lesson. But when I say here, lesson 1A, lesson 1B, lesson 2, lesson 3, I mean lesson 1.1 to 1.4 is lesson 1. Lesson 2.1 to 2.4 is lesson 2. So you can see if you're meeting 3 or 4 times a week, right? If you're meeting 4 times a week, it's very easy. You do one of these for homework, and then you come to class and you talk about that, whatever lesson you did. And so that brings us to these slides. These are in-class slides. So now switching to Hebrew, I should have done this earlier. Should have demoed it in Hebrew, but I'm just showing you the in-class material in Hebrew. So this is for lesson 4. All of the different things that you've learned, 4.1 to 4.4, in lesson 4 have been grouped together here. And you also have some exercises for each of those grammatical points, as well as some reading fluency exercises. So here's a reading fluency drill. It's called a read and look up drill. Basically, what you do is you go through these slides. So this is what you would do in the classroom. Okay, so you want extra practice to use the language more in the classroom. Here's the material. So in the classroom, my suggestion is that you go through these slides, you answer any questions about the material, the grammar, and you just practice using the language, okay, through these slides. So I have, again, a description here of what the exercise is, and you would just go through this material to help the students learn the language better. It's all laid out for you. So in the beginning, there's these reading fluency drills, again, to try to get the students to start to think and read well in the language. And then we have these drills that are specifically about a grammar point that they learned in the lesson. You can see these grammar points here. And then the drills that are paired with them. So this is a writing drill. This gives them practice doing different things with these forms. So this is for in-class material. All you have to do, we've had teachers literally show up and 10 minutes before figure out what the drills are and just go through the slides with the students. Very, very easy. So they're doing this, the app, for homework. They're coming to class. You're doing the slides. You're not doing anything, right? You're just prepping. You're not even prepping. You're just showing up and doing whatever material we've laid out for you. We also have this reading log. So this is for students to track how fast they're reading. So again, reading speed is actually a very important metric, correlates strongly with reading comprehension, and that's ultimately what we want. So this is a way, again, for you as a teacher to either do this in class. Yes, there are many second language acquisition classrooms, or SLA, let's say SLA-minded language classrooms, where you're doing extensive reading or fluency drill exercises in class. So you could use this, and this is actually some of the drills that we have are repeated reading, but this could also just be for homework. You need to get to, let's say, 80 words per minute for all of these stories. However long it takes you, once you're at 80 words per minute, you're done. So this is the kind of drill that we would recommend. It would be great because then it forces you to get to a certain reading speed for each of these drills. That forces you to get fluent, have the alphabet and these words. So we provide this as well, the reading log, and we provide, these are quizzes, as well as bigger assessments. We will provide those as well. But this is a quiz for lessons 3.1 and 3.4. So this is an easy way to just quiz your students every week if you wanted. You could skip weeks, doesn't really matter, right? But we have the quizzes for every week. And so this is all stuff that they should know from the app, the vocabulary words, a reading comprehension passage, again, from the app, just to make sure that they're doing what they need to be doing. They're reading, understanding, they're following. We have some parsing. We know that they need to be able to parse, fill in the blank with a sentence, as well as just parsing a word. Translation, again, we include this kind of thing because this is standard and it's good to have some practice with it. But as you can see, it's a small part. The parsing and translation, really the vocabulary and the reading comprehension, this is where we want to live as much as we can, especially the reading comprehension, because that's ultimately what we want to do, is read and comprehend the Bible. So finally, there's a textbook. So let me just pull up this textbook and just show you. So we will give you a PDF copy of this. Is a draft version right now. We have a schedule for 15 weeks or the first 2 semesters. You can see each chapter has learning objectives, the vocabulary that you learn, discussion on phonology. So much of this is paired with the videos, the same topics that are covered in the videos, but it's in written form, and we've changed some things and made it a bit easier to understand as a written work. Every 3 lessons or chapters in the textbook, we also have a section on linguistics. So in this case, Pollination's 4 strands. How do you learn languages, right? We start with this one because we want our students to learn the best way to learn. And we think part of them learning a language is learning the most efficient way to learn that language. So we talk about meaning focused input, meaning focused output, just different things about the 4 strands of language learning. We also compare that to a typical language classroom, things like that. So every 3 chapters, like I said, you'll get this. We have a section on phonology, on accents, helping your students to understand accents, why they're significant. And then we'll get into semantics, lexical semantics, how do we analyze words? And then we also will take these linguistic sections and apply them, especially the syntax and semantic sections into the morphology. So this, for example, is the first application of a semantic section in exegesis. So we're looking at the meaning of this stem, tereo. And so what does this stem mean? How do we go about thinking through what this stem means, right? And what we're trying to do in this section is take what you learned, the principles you learned, the concepts you learned in this lexical semantic section, and apply that to a real text and a real problem. This is ultimately what people are after, right? They want to be able to read Greek and Hebrew, and they want to be able to understand the text better than if they had just been reading in English. So we teach them, hey, how do you analyze words? And then we say, okay, let's put that into practice. And this is these exegesis sections that we have, about 7 of these throughout the book that are covering different topics. What are tense and aspect, and how do you apply that to an actual text? These are some of the things that we do in the textbook. Like I said, you will get a draft of this textbook. As you can see, this particular version has through chapter 15, so enough for your first semester. And then you have this section on basic word order. These also are filled out, and we will have the next semester as well, certainly through lesson 24. We actually have it ready. It's just not in this document right here. So that is a basic overview of the textbook. And we have covered, let me see here. So let's just go back to this overview screen now, and we can summarize what we have said. So we talked about the goal of a language course. We said the goal of a language course is to acquire the language. We also said that Greek and Hebrew are unique in that you need to be able to talk about the language. And traditional language classrooms are really built around that notion of talking about the language. That's not a bad thing. We used Merkel and Plummer's textbook as an example. And for what it does, it's a great textbook to help you talk about the language. It's not geared to you acquiring the language in the same way. And so we think at Biblingo, you should be doing both. Okay. So that's why we've geared all of our materials to you doing both of those things at the same time. And so we take the goals of the SLA literature and we put the methods in Biblingo that will allow you to reach those goals, while at the same time not neglecting the goals of the biblical studies world to exegete the text carefully. Next, we talked about Biblingo's grammatical progression and schedule, and we said basically that we have tried to take SLA principles and create our grammatical progression and schedule around those principles. That is different than traditional textbooks. Again, they're doing something different. We think that it's complementary, and that's why we have included those kinds of materials to help you talk about the language. While at the same time, we are wanting to teach you how to acquire the language, and we want to help you, give you the material to acquire the language so that you can read the text fluently and you can understand Greek for Greek or Hebrew for Hebrew. Next, we went through an app demo. We explored the basics of the app. There's actually a lot more to it, but what we saw will give you the basics of what students will do day in and day out in the app itself. And then we looked at in-class materials for the slides, quizzes, our reading log, basically everything you need, the textbook, everything you need to adopt Biblingo. And we want to make this as easy as possible. You can just assign Biblingo for homework, come to class, do the slides, have your students read through the textbook, answer any questions that they have them do a quiz, and you know, my 3-year-old or 4-year-old now likes to say, boom, done, right? Boom, done. You just show up. We don't want you. We've done the planning for you. Show up, read the notes we have on the slides, use the quizzes we've already created, and use the materials that we have made so that your students can learn to become lifelong learners of the biblical languages. And that's really what we are about. We want students, after they're done with this, we don't care if they don't finish the whole course. That's okay, right? They can just keep going, and they need to keep going, right? Even if they finish an introductory textbook, certainly they're not over. They're only at the beginning. And so we think that if you can get through 25 or so lessons in 2 semesters, fantastic. And if they are motivated at the end of that to continue on and get through all 52 lessons, right? They're so much further ahead than if they are discouraged. And you've covered, doesn't matter how many forms you've covered, if they stop using and wanting to use the language at the end of 2 semesters. So that's what we're all about. We're all about making the biblical languages easier to learn and more accessible, and fostering this attitude of being a lifelong learner. So we thank you for watching this webinar, and feel free, if you have any questions on how to use Biblingo in the classroom, email me, kevin@biblingo.org. You get questions like this all the time. I'm happy to meet with you, answer any questions you might have. I know this is different. I know it's weird, to have an app for your primary resource, but we really believe that Biblingo can empower your students to not only become lifelong learners of the biblical languages, but to love the biblical languages and to use them daily in their devotions, in their sermon prep, in their studies, in whatever they might be doing. We think it is possible to read these texts in the original and to enjoy doing so. That's what we're all about at Biblingo, and we hope that Biblingo can help you to empower your students to do the same. Thanks again for watching.